Welcome everyone to Chat with an Academy Scientist. I'm very happy that you're all joining us today. The Academy is home to quite a few researchers. Our mission is to explore, explain, and sustain life on this planet. And we do part of that by having some explorers out there. And everyone, this is Dave Blackburn. Can we give him a round of applause? Welcome him here today. You had no idea, right, that you would get a whole round of applause?
No, it was awesome. Thank you.
So, Dave, what do you do here?
So that's a good question. On Saturdays, they let me come out of the basement. So I am a scientist here. We have about 20 PhD scientists that work here at the Academy, all of which do very different things. We all study different groups of organisms. So my specialty is frogs. So I'm a curator of herpetology. So herpetology is the study of amphibians and reptiles.
Anyone out there a fan of herpetology? Who likes frogs? Okay. Who likes snakes? Sure. Who doesn't like frogs or snakes? Okay, don't tell Dave.
That's right. You can.
Don't tell him. Don't hurt his feelings.
So what I do here at the Academy is I am a research scientist. So I study the diversity of life on Earth. For the most part, I focus on frogs, and I work largely in Africa for most of my time in Africa. So most amphibians in Africa are frogs. So that's what I spend my time working on. There's very few salamanders in Africa.
Well, that works out pretty well. What would you say inspired you to do this? What's so cool about frogs, especially? How did you get into this?
So I started working on amphibians and frogs, I don't know. When I got interested in college, it's a group of animals that's really remarkable. It has remarkable life histories. But I didn't start off as an amphibian biologist. I started off as this guy here, who you can't see, with my head buried under dinosaur fossils in the middle of the Saharan desert. So my interest actually has always been in time and understanding how animals evolve and the diversity of life on Earth. And then sort of I fell into working on frogs. This is actually a frog right there. And that frog, that same species, by the end of this year will be on exhibit here at the Academy. And that's a species of frog that's found only in one crater lake in Africa. So I started working on frogs more than a decade ago. And most of my work is really focused on describing new species and understanding aspects of the biology of a lot of these animals that we simply know very little about. Just because an animal has a name, because it's been formally described to science, doesn't really mean we know anything about it other than that it exists. Right. So a lot of my time is trying to answer those other questions.
Although I bet some of you know a little bit about frogs at least. Anyone want to share a factoid? What do we know about frogs? Anyone? Anyone want to share a factoid? What makes a frog a frog? What's their skin like? What are their toes like? I guess there are lots of different kinds.
Do they have a tail? No. Oh, they do, right?
Tadpoles
as a tadpole,
do,
right? So then they lose it. Wait, so how many species of frogs are there? Just a guess.
Hundreds.
Hundreds?
12,000?
That's a little high, but maybe we're headed there. There's more than 6,200 species of frogs. It's actually more species of frogs than of all the types of mammals you can think of. So there's more species of just frogs than of all mammals.
Now, this brings up...
So far. Well, actually, there'll be even more species of frogs.
Actually, I have a little bit of a clip here. I think it's going to work. Let's see if I can turn it up. Oh, that's not turning it up.
The larvae which go by the name tadpoles, to the Sicilians that wiggle in their holes, to the
just to give
giant
you an
salamanders
idea.
that grow and grow. Most
Some of
lay
the
eggs,
really-
their blood runs cold, but they're not lizards, no, no, no. They're amphibians, 7,000 kinds of amphibians. Stomp your feet, clap your hands, 7,000 kinds of amphibians. Pippa hatches larvae in its back.
Rhinoderma rufum
Holds them in its vocal sac.
Eurecia cisorum.
External gills on its head.
Discophus antongilia.
It's tomato-like and red. Most lay eggs, their blood runs cold. They're not lizards, no, no, no. They're amphibians.
All right.
7,000 kinds of amphibians. Stomp your feet.
All right, one more
clap
little
your
verse.
hands. 7,000 kinds of amphibians. From the slimiest
All right.
frog.
I know, I'm sorry. I didn't want to go on too long with that, but can you tell us about the creation of that little bit?
Sure. So part of what we spend here as our time doing here as scientists is actually talking to the public, trying to communicate things about science and making it fun. So a lot of my life is actually spent doing that here on the public floor of the Academy, and through organizations like Amphibian, which actually produced that song. And so we're trying to find ways of popularizing things about amphibians. We actually have a remix in the works of that song for celebrating the 200th species of Sicilian, which is coming any day now.
What is the Sicilian?
I have a Sicilian. I don't think I have one. It's the third type of amphibian. There's frogs and toads, salamanders and newts, and Sicilians. And so Sicilians look like giant earthworms. They have vertebrae, just like us. They don't have arms and legs, and they spend most of their time burrowed underneath the ground or swimming inside ponds. Most people never, ever see them. They live in the tropics. There's not very many of them. But slowly we're chipping away at learning more and more about them.
Now, you have actually spent quite a bit of time out in the field looking for frogs, collecting specimens, and recently you had the chance to go to Cameroon, which is in Africa. Can you tell us a little bit about what some of the questions were that you were trying to answer by going off into the field and going off to different countries?
Sure. Does everyone know where Cameroon is? Kind of, sort of. So Africa is like an upside-down L, and it's the part that's right here. So it is an incredibly diverse place for all sorts of biological diversity, but including frogs. So Cameroon has more than 200 species. We're describing new species from there every year. So part of my research in Cameroon is focused on just simply knowing what the diversity is in Cameroon, but then beginning to ask questions about that diversity. So this is part of our team from earlier this year. It's myself. So we have 2 drivers, a Cameroonian colleague that will actually begin here as a graduate student later this year, and graduate students from the Bay Area and Texas, and all of us are working together on different types of projects. So Greg, who's a master's student of mine at San Francisco State, is working on these species. These are a widespread group of frogs in Africa that actually probably have many species that are undescribed, many species that are new to science. And one really cool part about these frogs is their biology. They seem to have lots of peptides, secretions in their skin. Almost any species you pick up smells different than the last species. Literally, you pick up the frog and some of them smell like pickles, or they smell like something else that's not really describable. So they have really interesting biology here, and so part of our work in the field is just beginning to document that, understand that. And some of the work that we're doing, as shown here, is doing other types of work. So Becca, who is here, is actually trying to understand. You see some of these frogs are really wonderfully colorful here. And so what Becca is doing is actually collecting little bits of secretion to try and understand, do they have alkaloids in their skin like poison dart frogs? So poison dart frogs have these toxins in their skin. And people always ask me about this for African frogs. We have literally no idea if they do or do not. So this was part of the work we were doing there. And what I'm doing here is actually work that's related to conservation and disease. So there are many, many different threats to amphibians worldwide, but one of them is a fungus. It's a fungus that infects the skin of frogs and salamanders and Sicilians, and will ultimately in many species cause them to die. And so this is a threat to amphibians worldwide. It's led to a lot of extinctions. And so what we were doing on this project is sampling for this disease, seeing if it's present at the places where we're working, the places where we're actually describing new species from, right? These species are threatened even before we know they exist. And also beginning to understand what are the type of defenses that these frogs have against this fungus. You know, whether or not there are secretions in their skin that are important for that, or what I've been doing here is actually trying to understand the bacteria that occur on their skin naturally and offer essentially a natural antibiotic to this fungus. So we're doing all sorts of things when in the field.
So why frogs, though? Why is it so important to study frogs?
Why is it important to study frogs?
Yeah, well, maybe some of you can think about this. What do frogs eat? How do they fit in with us? Any guesses? What do a lot of frogs eat? Anything they can fit in their mouth.
That's
a
the
great
answer. Anything they can fit in their mouth is the answer. Yeah, so frogs actually are great at cycling nutrients out in the food web, right? They're eating tons of tiny little things. So we often argue about, there's so many species that we can find in one single pond. How are they divvying up the world? It's not by food, right? If you go out and find mammals at a place, you find ones that they're specialized for eating all sorts of different things, right? Frogs, it's not the case. Frogs just eat whatever fits in their mouth. They're not dividing up the world by food. because their resources are not limited. Their resources are tiny little insects, and so they're eating huge amounts of these insects and cycling those nutrients up. Because what eats frogs? Tons of things.
Everything.
Birds,
Yeah.
snakes, lizards, other frogs, mammals. So there's lots of things that actually prey also on frogs.
So it would be
So-
a pretty big deal if, like, a chytrid fungus would take out a lot of those frogs.
There are, and we've definitely seen in some ecosystems, you basically are wiping out all of these populations within some of these habitats. And we have seen that where basically the forests become fairly quiet.
Okay, so you're a scientist out in the field looking for frogs. What does that really look like? If you say, oh, I'm a frog researcher, I go out in the field, I collect frogs, what exactly are you doing when you're out there? Are you camping? Are you looking out there with a big headlamp? What does that look like
So
exactly?
Frog scientists spend most of their time out at night. And we work all day, and then we go out at night. And then the next day we wake up and we work on the stuff we caught during the night. Then we have lunch. Then we go back out again. So we're constantly working when we're out in the field. We spend a lot of time camping in remote areas. Some of these areas are remarkably hard to get to. This is actually a really good road. But sometimes you have surprises like this, like you see there's a river on the map, and yes, the road continues across, and then you get there and you realize that there is no bridge, and this is the ferry, but the ferry doesn't have a motor, so you have to actually pull it across the river, and that's how you move your vehicles across. Sometimes it's a lot of work just doing these things. But what you're there ultimately for is finding animals, finding out what the diversity is like, but it can take a lot of work to get there. Most frog scientists spend all their time out at night with headlamps on, but often very fancy headlamps. So this is...
Is that a fancy one?
It is, only in the sense, does anybody mountain bike? Does anybody mountain bike at night? You can buy these really
have one of
awesome,
those?
high-powered... I have like way too many of them. I'm kind of a headlamp junkie. So we spend a lot of time out at night with headlamps. And what we're doing for the most part, when we catch frogs... Has anybody caught frogs before? I mean, you don't really need any sort of sophisticated thing to catch a frog. You use your hand to catch a frog. Sometimes it's a little harder. There are some ones that are harder. So, I always show up at pet stores and buy, a dozen of these, and they ask me funny questions about how many aquaria that I have at my house and things. But no, of course, I'm buying lots of them because we have a lot of people in our team, as you saw earlier. So we have, catching tadpoles. This is how we catch a lot of tadpoles. But of course, you have to remember we're flying to the other side of the world. And so it's hard in some cases to buy field tools. So we're always looking for things that collapse and are easy to take with us. So, we have things like this
Whoa.
for...
That's
let's see.
fancy.
Oh, very fancy.
Wow.
Now, it's, Bass Pro and Cabela are pretty great for field scientists. So we have these lightweight extendable nets. These are great for catching aquatic frogs. There's actually a lot of aquatic frogs in Africa that are impossible to go out into the water and catch because they're just incredibly fast when they're inside the water. But we don't only catch frogs. I actually spend a lot of time catching lizards and snakes. You don't see that many turtles and crocodiles, frankly, for finding them. So we can catch lizards by hand. If you're really fast, you can catch lizards by hand. I'm not actually that fast. Let me see if I have another. One other tool that we use sometimes is basically like a fishing pole with a little piece of, we use floss on the end of it that makes like a little noose, and we can catch lizards from far away. We also shoot them with rubber bands.
So it's like being a lizard cowboy.
Lizard cowboy.
Yeah.
That's right. There should be a movie. So a lot of times, like geckos, lizards that climb trees, they climb buildings, they climb restaurant walls, will be really high up. And so you can knock them off walls with rubber bands. And the one other thing that we spend a lot of time doing is catching snakes, which you don't tend to find that many of, often if you're out looking for frogs, only because we go looking for frogs in the rain. And usually there's not that many frogs out actually or snakes out in the rain. So we have snake tongs.
Before you put that back, I actually brought a snake with me today so that you could show us how this works.
So in many parts, in California, for instance...
Never do that with a snake, by the way. They're very nice creatures.
So it's, these are actually pretty handy tools. Most snakes actually can't get away if you have them like this. So usually we have several pairs of these while we're out in the field to catch snakes. And of course, in California, you can have a pretty good idea of whether or not you've caught a venomous snake. So especially in Northern California, if it's a rattlesnake, that's pretty much your only choice of a venomous snake around here. Farther south is a little different. But in parts of Africa, we really don't like to take any chances. There are some snakes that we know that are easy to identify, that right off the bat we say, okay, that's a venomous snake. We don't want to handle it. But there's a lot of other oddball snakes, and especially little snakes that are juveniles. They can be just as dangerous as adult snakes. So when we're in the field, we actually don't catch any of our snakes by hand. We catch all of them with tongs, and they go immediately in a bag so that we can handle them and identify them later beyond trying, while we're knee-deep in mud trying to figure out it's a venomous snake.
Actually, recently one of our scientists, thank you very much, snake. This is a little confusing for everyone, right? Recently, one of our scientists, our field medic, has figured out a way to make an anti-venom that you can push up your nose with a nasal spray instead of it needing to be through a needle, which is kind of a cool thing. So it means that things could be a lot more accessible. You could bring these things with you out in the field and administer outside in the field.
Yeah, it's actually not really an antivenom. What it does is it opens up the channels that are between nerves. So a lot of the venoms actually, they act by interfering between nerve cells communicating to one another. So what it does, it's actually a means of enhancing those few nerve cells that are still open. It buys you a lot of time. And ultimately, for a lot of snake bites, for certain types of snake bites, especially ones that are essentially neurotoxins, buying time is what you really need ultimately.
Right, but we don't want to talk about the scariness of snake venom
This is
necessarily.
the reality of field work,
actually, you should come out later to our snake show. We have some non-venomous snakes to bring out. But do you have some cool specimens to show to us as well about some of the frogs that are out there, maybe some that you've collected? And
so I have an oddball
some
group of
favorites.
things. Yeah, I always have favorites. People always ask me what my favorite species of frog is, so I'll show it to you in a second. This is not my ultimately favorite one.
Would you like a cart?
Yeah, I am. I just don't want to get anybody wet. So these are from our collections, our scientific research collections. So all of these things are in alcohol. Some of these things have been here a super duper long time, like on the order of 100 years or more. They've been part of our Academy collections. And they have tags on them. That's a name of a species, but it also says when it was found and where it was found. That's really important, right, for understanding, how the world is changing, that a species used to occur somewhere, now it doesn't. Or in a case like this is an invasive species. I caught these on next to the Academy about 2 weeks ago, so here they are, part of our collection. Working with Cal Fish and Game, who's trying to exterminate them from the pond because they're an invasive species. So we have some cool things. So Cameroon is home to a lot of amazing animals.
Oh my goodness.
So this is a Goliath frog. This specimen has been sitting here at the Academy for probably about 80 years. This is the biggest species of frog in the world. They can actually get, this is not a big one, they can get bigger. They can get a little bigger. They basically are the size of like a newborn child. They can weigh about 7-8 pounds when you catch adults. These are a species that's actually, for the most part, being hunted to extinction. They're hunted for food. You can buy them on the side of the road in parts of Cameroon as bushmeat. There's actually several species of these that in different parts of Africa, largely Cameroon, are hunted for food. These are a large aquatic frog, and really not much is known about their biology, but they're threatened with extinction largely because of consumption for food. Unlike most other species of frogs, that's not really a big issue for. So my favorite frog in the world, actually I'm going to hold it in here in the alcohol because it's a little bit better. So all of our collections are in alcohol. So it's not really, it basically evaporates off my hands. So my favorite frog in the world is the hairy frog. And so the hairy frog is a frog that's found in Cameroon and a couple neighboring countries. And it looks, hairy. And so the sides of its body are covered in what looks like hair. Turns out it's actually not hair. It's little pieces of skin. It's like you took a needle and you pricked its skin and you pulled out a thin little piece of skin. You guys see it? It's crazy, right? So the cool part of this species is that only males are hairy. Females aren't hairy. See that?
So the females must like the hairdo on the males, maybe.
We have no idea. We have really no idea. And these also are eaten in Cameroon. And this is really a remarkable species of frog. And one thing that this highlights is most of these frogs here are from our scientific collections. But as scientists like myself, we actually work with other people's scientific collections just as much as our own. These are actually just on loan to me from the Smithsonian as part of a project. So we're actually trying to study more about the hairy frog biology. And let's see, one more fun one real quick. Let's see which one I want to do. So we have You said you liked snakes. So this is a pretty awesome snake specimen. This is from Cameroon from earlier this year.
Whoa.
So we, this is not the whole snake. This is just a head. So this gives you a sense, a little bit of how we sometimes get specimens. So we actually go out and, we find representatives of specimens. We document where they are. This is the base. These things are what we use to describe new species. But a lot of times people bring us stuff. And so when we were in southern Cameroon recently in a rainforest, sometimes people bring us snakes. Now, does anyone have an idea why we would only have a head of this snake that someone brought us? Yeah, so these are really a delicacy. So this is a gaboon viper. And so gaboon vipers and pigeon there are called short snakes because they have these funny sort of wide bodies. And they're eaten. And so they ate the rest of it, and they brought us a head. And so these are really remarkable animals. This is one of probably the most dangerous snakes that, well, at least that we fear. They have enormous fangs, huge fangs, and they have these venom glands, huge venom glands that they can pump venom through. You can see how long its tooth is. Do you see that? It's crazy, right? So it actually, some of them have, they get bigger too. They have fangs that are basically enough to go through your hand. So we are always sort of very wary of snakes when we're in the field. But look at this. This is its gland. And so it's basically like a pouch that has venom in it. And when it squeezes it, the venom comes down, and that's how it injects it into like a mouse or something that it's going to eat for dinner.
Yeah, I guess an important point to make is that people are not the main menu item for these snakes. I don't think you or I would fit into that snake's mouth.
Definitely not.
As open as it can stretch it, it looks like. Go ahead.
Let me do one more, just to give you one more feel. If you're interested afterwards, I can hang out and you can see other things. But this is a frog. This is actually a type of toad. They're called golden frogs, although it's confusingly a species of toad. This particular one is from Ecuador from the 1950s. A scientist from the academy was working in Ecuador. We have a specimen from there. This species, and many of these species, these golden frogs, you can see him here. Many of these frogs are actually extinct now, including this species. So one of the reasons some of our scientific collections are important, this is only one or two individuals that were collected for scientific research at some point. But what's happened since then is that a lot of these habitats have been critically destroyed, and diseases have gone through a lot of these populations and caused these species to go extinct. So the only evidence that we even have of their existence are these. And sometimes we don't find out about that until well after they've already gone extinct, which is kind of surprising, right? And the only reason is because somewhere in a museum somewhere, someone happened to have caught one. No one ever realized it was a new species until after it was extinct. Until after it was extinct. So we're now caught in this conundrum where we're actually describing new species of amphibians after they're already extinct. So we've sort of migrated into the realm of paleontology for some parts of amphibian biology, which is a real shocker, especially as someone that started as a paleontologist.
Yeah, and some of these are not even ancient. They recently went extinct.
Many of these have gone extinct in the last 20 to 30 years.
Wow. So if you were to encourage us to figure out a way to help out these species or to help out these different frog habitats, what are some things that we can provide for frogs to help them out?
Well, one thing is providing critical habitat. So an important thing that we spend a lot of time doing, even as Academy scientists, is providing advice to state and government officials, and also in the countries where we work, to the scientific ministries that we work with, providing expertise on where these species are found, what might be the best ways to help manage these habitats, to preserve them there. In the local areas, one of the biggest threats, it's not really disease, it's habitat loss. So especially in parts of California for amphibians, but many species, loss of wetlands is a big problem for many amphibian species.
Right.
So one thing that we're doing here at the Academy, and later this year you can come see them, on a recent trip we got several species that are live animals that are brought back, so not preserved frogs, but live frogs that are downstairs now in the Academy's quarantine facility. Many of these frogs are infected with this fungus, so we're trying to cure them before we integrate them into our living collections here. And what we'll be doing with these frogs, like this frog here, this is a critically endangered species found in one lake on one mountain, period. That's it. And there's a lot of ways in which the habitat around that lake is changing, and they could easily, very quickly, become threatened. They're already critically endangered, but there's only imminent threats, not an actual threat right now. So the one of the things that we're doing here at the Academy is actually trying to learn more about their reproduction and their behavior and their biology so that we can help save these frogs in the field. Not here at the Academy, but actually learn knowledge, gain knowledge that's important for their conservation in Africa at the sites where these frogs are actually found.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So eventually all those animals that or some of these frogs you'll see on the floor will be part of a project to save wild frogs. That's pretty neat to be able to see the direct evidence of something that's going to be helping out in the future.
A neat part of here at the Academy is that we're a weird mix of an aquarium and a natural history museum. And the advantage of that is that most natural history museums don't have live animals. And most zoos and aquaria don't have people that actually really go out and study and find the diversity of life. And so we have a great opportunity here. If we go out and find new species, we go out and see things threatened in the wild, we have really immediate actions we can take working with our live animal team here at the aquarium.
That's
pretty cool.
That's pretty inspiring. So does anyone have questions? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so what kind of permissions do you need to go to a place like Cameroon? How long do you go, and what kind of permits do you need to go and collect? Was that? Yeah.
Yep, that's a really good question. So the one thing that sort of most people don't realize about scientists is how much paperwork we spend doing. So we really spend a long time planning for these trips, well in advance. And so, for instance, in Cameroon, we get permission from several different ministries to actually do scientific research in Cameroon. We have, so that's a permit. We get permission for working in national parks and forestry. Those are one permit and then separately negotiated for anything underneath that, you know, for a park or a forest. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And as you might guess, some of these places don't move very quickly with their paperwork. So it takes a lot of effort. I usually go for 3 to 4 weeks for short trips, partly because I have 2 little boys. Those are my longest trips, they're 3 or 4 weeks. But luckily, we can leave graduate students there much longer. So the graduate students hang out, and they're very happy to stay. So that answers that. And then there's also a long tail of an expedition. It can take years to work through and really study all of the things that are collected during our trips. And as far as working with animals here in the U.S., when we come back, we basically, the way it works is we file paperwork, all of our original paperwork that comes from the country of origin with U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
Okay.
That's largely it, unless there's particular things related to agricultural pests and things, which frogs aren't an issue for.
Any other questions out there? Good question. Yeah, over here.
Yeah. So how do you know that you have a new species? You know, how do you have an inkling of that? For the most part, it requires knowing a lot, I guess. So I spent a lot of time as a specialist on particular groups of frogs that I know very well. And so I can find them in the field and have a suspicion immediately like, whoa, this doesn't look like anything that we know about. But a lot of times it's much more subtle than that. And so the way that we really study them is coming back. One of the tools that we really use is genetics. I mean, genetics is critically important to pretty much everything we do here at the Academy. So we have our own genetics lab actually downstairs at the Academy. And genetics can be a helpful tool, but then we also do a lot of detailed study of the actual animals. And now, having a little bit of biology that we can even do in-house, we can add that on top of it. But there's no single recipe for describing new species and knowing. But largely what it is either knowing it yourself or knowing the right person to ask.
Yeah, having that intuition. Have you ever had a moment where you have a frog in your hand and you think to yourself, this is a new species. I think this is Eureka. I've got it.
Yes.
Yeah?
Uh-huh. Yeah, definitely.
There you go. Very cool. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. So So the question was about golden toads in Panama and actually other countries as well. And so what it seems has happened in most of these habitats is very likely related to this fungal disease and that infects the skin. And so what's happened, it seems like through the 1970s and 1980s, it looks like this fungus actually swept south through Mexico and then through Central America. And actually we've also been able to see it now sweeping through the Andes in the 90s and 2000s, where we have the same type of animals also declining in those habitats. And the way that we can do that, right? You might say, well, how could you do that? Because that was the past. Like, how would you ever figure out the past, right? This right here. So all these animals have a place and a time when they were found, and they all still have skin. So we can actually go to these animals and look at their skin and know, did they have that disease? And use that to start putting together a map of how this disease spread through space and time.
Yeah.
So it does seem like with golden toads, that's probably what happened in some of these habitats, which was basically a really pristine forested habitat where suddenly, especially a very emblematic bright orange toad species, suddenly just disappeared. And it wasn't, I think, last seen in 1985.
So why would one frog go
Yeah, so
extinct?
one
and
of
maybe
one of
other
the
ones
things that
wouldn't?
we are still really trying to understand is the biology of the diseases and how certainly it can be the case that different species have very different susceptibilities to the fungus. In this particular case, this one, what seems to be one species of fungus. It can spread across amphibians, across different species, from frogs to salamanders, different species of frogs. But some frogs basically act as carriers. They just don't die. Bullfrogs, terrible about that. Clawed frogs, not that one, but these ones that were here in Golden Gate Park, they'll get infected and they don't die. And so when they spread through habitats, they can also spread the fungus, which is a critical problem, unfortunately. And some of these frogs, like bullfrogs, are actually traded around for food. We actually have bullfrogs that are raised in Asia and then imported back into the U.S. for food and things like that.
Wow. Oh, one more question over here.
Yeah.
So is the same species of fungus worldwide?
Yes. Believed to be so.
Chytrids.
It's believed to be the same fungus, one species of fungus worldwide, though probably in the next month you'll hear about a second species of fungus as well. But they're basically two very closely related species of fungus. Yes, and so this has also caused extinctions in Australia. Australia, Central America, and Northern South America have been very critically hit. It seems like some parts of Southern Europe, this may have been a problem. One idea is that it ultimately comes from Africa. And we've actually been doing a lot of work here at the Academy addressing that since I work in Africa. And it seems actually that in the past in Africa, in most places, it really wasn't present. And certainly in some places in Africa now, you can't find it at all. And Africa west of Nigeria doesn't exist. Madagascar doesn't exist. And it seems in the last few years it's really increased in prevalence. And we do have some suggestions that there are even declines in Cameroon that could possibly be related. So it's really a sort of a global problem, and a lot of the work that we need to do focuses on the biology of the fungus and trying to understand the disease better so that we can hope to do something about it.
Right, and maybe part of that is the immune systems of frogs. If we can keep their water very clean out in the environment, keep them having those healthy environments, I think.
Sure.
I've heard that's a pretty good idea there. Now, I know that I've kept you all for a while, and so I'm going to wrap it up. If you have questions, I'm going to ask that you ask them afterwards.
Okay.
But can we all give a really big round of applause to Dave
Thank you.
for coming out?